Welcome, everyone. This is the live virtual roundtable event where we'll discuss from words to action and strategies for ensuring business leaders deliver on DEI outcomes. I'm your moderator, Douglas Brown, CEO at Halo Consulting, a certified minority-owned boutique executive search firm based in Chicago. Halo was founded in April of 2020 to provide the process-oriented best practices our team developed at top executive search firms with a risk-free, cost-effective fee model tailored for early-stage and high-growth startups for their most critical hire. If you're new to this event, Halo hosts monthly virtual roundtable events like this one for HR, tech, and DEI leaders on a variety of topics. Don't forget to check out the Halo series and Halo mini series where we hear from executives taking a deep dive into what's keeping them up at night. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, the Halo Content Hub, which summarizes current market trends and recaps past events. And that can be found on LinkedIn, and I'll post that in the chat here shortly. This event is being recorded. And feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A function, and we'll address those questions throughout the session. Early next week, we will be sharing a survey to gather your feedback, and we will post a recorded version of this event to our YouTube channel on Monday. Today, we are joined by a stellar group of DEI strategists, and for our event, we want this to be an interactive session, so please ask questions using the Q&A function. First, I would like to introduce Kesha Carter. Kesha is the Chief Diversity Officer for Coordinated Care Services, Inc. There, she leads the organizational strategy on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism. She has facilitated DEI workshops, conversations, and trainings, both locally and nationally. Kesha is a certified diversity executive and holds a Six Sigma Green Belt, as well as a professional human resources certification from the Human Resource Capital Institute. She was also a Young Athena Award finalist in 2019 and 2020, and a Democratic and Chronicle Woman to Watch in October of 2016. Integrally involved in the community, Kesha is a board member of Rochester Regional Health Information Organization, the Women's Council, Mission Fulfilled, and Willow Domestic Violence Center, and is also a member of Zeta Pi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Kesha brings over 15 years of experience to her role and is committed to creating continuous growth through education and collaboration. Great to have you on the panel, Kesha. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Crutchfield. Dr. Angela M. Crutchfield is an executive leadership consultant and coach with a focus on transformational human resources and culture change related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Angela is also a lifestyle coach for women with a specific focus on support of women demonstrating wholeness. In addition to heading a business consulting practice, Dr. Angela currently serves as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion for Riverside Community Care in Boston, along with previously serving as the Vice Chancellor for Talent and Chief Diversity Officer for the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and also served as the Director for OD Learning and Diversity and Inclusion for Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. As a longtime transformational human resources professional and diversity and inclusion practitioner, Dr. Angela has a unique blend of human capital and organizational insight, people skills, and tactical know-how that combine for delivery of exceptional personal coaching, training program design, and delivery and business consultation. With a vast client list for over 25 years, Dr. Angela has helped thousands of people achieve higher levels of success in leadership competencies. Her unrivaled engaging style, sense of humor, and motivational presentations have earned rave reviews from leaders and audiences around the country. She demonstrates liveliness that reflects a matchless energy and style that is most impactful for learning and driving personal organizational behavioral change. Dr. Angela lives life based on personal passion to positively impact the lives of others. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Crutchfield. Our final panelist joining us today is Dr. Mason. Dr. James Mason is the Chief EDI and Chief Human Resources Officer for Care Oregon, Inc. He founded and is the CEO of Organizational Culture Competence Assessment and Training, a DEI and culture competence consulting firm. Dr. Mason is the former Chief Diversity Officer for Providence Health and Services and the former Director of the Office of Multicultural Health for the state of Oregon. He is the founding member of the National Center on Culture Competence at Georgetown University, where he served as the senior consultant. Dr. Mason has consulted with professional schools and programs, health and human services, bureaucracies, and health and human service provider groups in North America on issues of workforce diversity and culturally competent service delivery. Dr. Mason lives in Portland, Oregon, and has conducted health and human service research and training for over 25 years. We're excited to have you, Dr. Mason.
Thank you.
All right, let's dive into our first question. Dr. Mason, from your experience, what are some effective strategies for holding business leaders accountable for delivering DEI outcomes and creating inclusive workplace culture?
I think a lot of organizations have mission statements that speak to diversity, and how we operationalize those are important. So I find strategic planning is critical. Metrics are critical, and ultimately having a rationale for why one is embarking on this path is also critical. That message would resonate differently with boards, consumers, other professionals. But ultimately, I think that without a plan or without metrics, without a rationale, it might be hard pressed to sustain the effort.
Thanks, Dr. Mason. Anything to chime in, Kesha or Dr. Crutchfield?
Well, I definitely agree with Dr. Mason, and I would say there has to be I term it a three-legged stool. I know there are different variations of a three-legged stool that people reference when they talk about diversity and inclusion, but for me, I view it as ensuring you have your engagement of board, engagement of leadership, and engagement of your employees through establishment of ERGs and having those leaders to be a part of the conversation and making sure that even the board is pulled in. As Dr. Mason said, oftentimes we exclude the board and we don't have that appropriate dialogue with them. And I think those are some important things around accountability.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Dr. Crutchfield and Dr. Mason. And in addition to that, I think it's really important to build in the accountability to the other accountabilities that leaders have. So if for CFOs, right? So even for a CFO, building in some accountability in how they're incorporating DEI initiatives into the work that they do for, all of the leaders in the organization, being able to have them look outside of just, having tunnel vision in the work that they are responsible for, and understanding how they're building that in as well, and being able to incorporate that into the work that they're doing, and having those conversations in the one-on-ones, and in, performance reviews, however you do them, quarterly conversations, annual performance reviews, however you do them in your organization, building that in and having that accountability really be kind of black and white, instead of having it be this gray thing that kind of exists out there that folks aren't really sure how they're going to verbalize and communicate what they're doing with those initiatives also.
The next question we want to address is, how can organizations address resistance from hesitant business leaders to prioritize DEI initiatives and seamlessly integrate DEI efforts into core business operations? Kesha, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. So one of the things, like I just talked about, building it into those accountabilities, in addition to that, normalizing the conversations, making sure that folks are not afraid to have the conversations that dive into different areas of DEI and everything under the umbrella of DEI as well, so that there's starting with that foundation with learning and development, so that folks understand when we're saying certain words, this is what we mean, and everybody in the room is not having their own specialized thought around what that means, but we all know what we're talking about within this organization. Building it into the supports and the tasks, the actions of the operating plan or strategic plan for the organization. So knowing how the DEI initiatives are going to support where the organization is going, the goals that the organization has as well. And so that it's very seamless in how all of the initiatives under DEI really support everything that the organization wants to do, who they say they are, and how they operationalize those things. And then the last two are, the leadership and role modeling. So again, with that accountability for leaders, having them understand how they can role model to other folks what those initiatives are and how they show up in practical ways in day-to-day interactions, day-to-day work functions, and all of that. And then lastly, building it into the budget. If it's not part of the budget, then it really doesn't matter for an organization. Organizations budget for all of the other initiatives that they want to have. And oftentimes the DEI initiatives are kind of an afterthought or tacked on to something. And, in addition to this thing that we put all of this money into, you got to be mindful of DEI, right? And so instead of doing that, really building into the budget, having a budget line item for how you're going to operationalize those DEI initiatives. And that helps to reduce that resistance and that hesitancy from folks within the organization, so that they know that there's nothing budgetary and there's nothing from a leadership expectation in the way they do their work holding them back from leaning into those conversations, those tasks, and those actions.
And I really appreciate you bringing up that topic around budget, because I think when you put it in the terms, you got to put things in the terms that leaders understand. When you talk money, leaders understand that. So not only from a budgetary perspective, but when you think about this work that we are all doing, and those of you who are leaders, you want to keep this in mind. We want to do right by people, right? And we want to do right by people for 3 reasons. Number one, it's legally the right thing to do. We've got laws in place. And it's also morally the right thing to do. We want to treat people with respect and value people for who they are. But as Kesha just mentioned, logically, it just makes sense because it impacts the bottom line of an organization. When people are treated right, they're going to perform better. And all of that then results in greater performance of the organization. So 100% agree with you on those thoughts.
Yeah, I would add, I think Kesha kicked it off well, and Dr. Crutchfield drove it home, but the idea of why we're doing it. For many, many years, when I would go on the road, I would talk about what diversity was, what cultural competence was, what health equity is. I spend much more time talking about how it's in an organization's best interest. And as Dr. Crutchfield alluded to, bottom line is critical. It might manifest itself in terms of utilization, typically if you're in the public sector, market share if you're in the private sector, but all of it distills down to it being in the organization's best interest. For example, if you're not retaining staff, you're spending about 1/3 to 1/2 of an employee's salary refilling that position. So for example, I reach out to hire Dr. Crutchfield. I don't treat her well. She leaves. She badmouths me and tells all of her friends, don't go work for James unless you can't find any other place to work.
Absolutely. I'll be out.
And you throw me on the bus just like that, right?
That's right.
So one of the rationale that we do this is around efficiency. It's a cost savings. The other is if we do this well, we serve our clients better. They trust us, they like us, they come in early, so they don't wait till something's falling off, so the treatment is costly or inoperable. Things like that are also critical. She also mentioned the idea of budget. If it's not in the budget, it don't matter. If it's not in the metrics, it doesn't matter. And then as I talk about strategic planning, it is so critical, and I think Kesha alluded to this, it has to be in the executives, the chiefs, the leaders' work plans. It has to be manifested in their job descriptions. Just to put it in a mission statement and let it die there, it's going to die there. So, and then the other thing I would add to this is let's repeat that message as to why fairly often, and that tends to hold our feet to the fire.
Kesha, in your response, you touched on leadership and role modeling while holding these leaders accountable. Do you have an example of where this has been successful?
Yeah, so thinking about an organization that I worked with, so in my role, I lead internal functions of DEI, as well as part of what we do at CCSI is external consulting. And so part of my team also consults with other organizations. And so I worked with an organization where the leadership was really in tune, the executive leadership was really in tune and really had they were really genuine about wanting to move these initiatives forward. They faced some resistance, more so from the middle management, because they had the idea of, if folks just come in, do their jobs, we'll be okay, right? Treat people the way that they want to be treated. Let's treat everybody by the golden rule. And I tell folks, let's treat people by the platinum rule. Let's treat people how they want to be treated, right? And so let's pull that back a little bit and relearn some things that we've learned our whole lives. And one of the things that we did with that organization was help them understand, as Dr. Mason talked about, that communication. It's one thing to say, you know, to be really genuine and want to do this and be able to say, here's what we're doing, you know, amongst the group that understands it and knows it and is carrying out that work. If the rest of the organization doesn't know what you're doing, it doesn't really matter. They don't feel it. They don't believe it when you say things. And so part of that was the communication. So they had to communicate. We developed a communication plan where they were communicating with the entire workforce around why this was important, what they plan to do. It started out big picture. Here's what we plan to do. And then starting to have those regular touch bases with the entire organization around, we told you this is what we want to do. Here's what we're focusing on in this first 6 months, right? And then end of that 6 months, here's what we told you we were going to focus on. Here is how we progressed on that, and being very transparent and honest about if we didn't meet all of those objectives, here's what got in the way, here's what we didn't think about before, and you know, here's what we're doing to fix that, and here's what you can expect from us for the next 6 months. And so really getting them comfortable with that transparency and that honesty. And it was more so the workforce holding the leaders accountable, and not just the leaders holding themselves accountable or each other accountable, because now they communicated that out and folks could then show up to work and say, you told me this is who you were. You told me this is what you're doing. I'm not seeing that. I'm not feeling that. And so they had an accountability in that kind of way. And after a 2-year engagement working with that organization, they had a really good cadence of communicating and really got to a high level of comfortability with that transparency and that vulnerability with the entire workforce, which served them well.
Great. Thanks, Kesha. Thanks for sharing that example. From your experience, Dr. Crutchfield, what data and metrics can business leaders use to track and measure progress on DEI outcomes when incorporating DEI initiatives into the core business?
Well, there are some standard metrics that, you know, any D&I practitioner will tell you, 7 or so, maybe 8, attrition, performance, you know, thinking about promotions and leadership pipeline, those types of things, pay equity, you know, measuring those numbers. And most of those things are quantitative metrics, and there's nothing wrong with quantitative metrics, but I encourage more qualitative measures. How do we get to a place where we really are getting to the heart of this type of work? So I encourage leaders to focus on an approach that starts with hearing the voice of their employees, which should end with the sustainable change that is ultimately measurable. And hearing your voice, hearing a person's voice or the voice of the employees, you know, this is where that platinum rule comes in, right? You know, Kesha mentioned that, and I use platinum rule all the time. This is where it comes in, and this is a core part of an important model that I use, that I put in place, that I call the LEPAS culture change model, LEPAS. It is my own personal model that I use with various clients, as well as within Riverside Community Care. And this model includes really 5 basic things. They're so basic, it's almost, you know, scary to say them out loud. First of all, we have to listen. We have to then educate. We have to plan. We have to actually take action and then sustain the changes. And this is a reflection of some key components that are possible for tangible data. So this means, for example, if you're focused on hearing a voice of your employees, this means you're going to have a diversity and inclusion employee survey. I want to hear from my staff. I want to know what's going on, what are we doing right, where are we missing it, and that employee gives opportunity to give information. So an employee connects survey, that is golden, That's golden information and data. And that survey should include specific questions related to the organization's demonstration of what we keep terming cultural competence. Dr. Mason has used that term. You introduced him in that. His business has that term tagged in it. Cultural competence is where we want to operate. If we stay on one side and we just look at diversity, we're looking at that quantitative piece. We need to get on the other side of the table and look on that qualitative side of, are we truly being inclusive and hearing their voice first? That data should then be analyzed appropriately. And then it should be shared with leaders. And this is where that accountability piece comes in. Because if I share data with leaders, I'm going to set an expectation of them to learn from that data and do something about it. Because I've heard now the voice of my employees, and I want to do something with that information that I've heard. And once I've heard that voice, once I've taken in that information, now you know what I need? I need a plan. What is my strategic plan for addressing this, in this case, the survey data? You still need to have a plan, period, a general plan for the organization, your strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. But if we're going to pull key things, let's look at that data, right? And then this is going to create an expectation that we are going to set some actions into motion. We can't just get the data and sit on the data. Get the data and say, look, we have data. No, you have to actually leverage that data, take action. And if we're taking action, we're trying to go somewhere. It's a journey. Cultural competence is a journey. And it's a journey, if done well, people like Kesha, Dr. Mason, myself will be worked out of a job. But see, we're still working because we haven't gotten this thing right. We can measure all day long. We can talk about data all day long. But if we're not putting it into action and building out a sustainable approach that hardwires excellence within our organization so that my melanin in my skin is valued, same as a person with none in their skin, the same as a person who might have a need for an assisted device, who might have a disability, a person who's in the LGBTQ plus community. If we are not building out plans, taking actions that are sustainable, we are going to be working for the rest of our lives trying to change the culture. And it shouldn't be that way. Companies should be able to hardwire this work that we're talking about. We've been talking about it for far too long. We've got to take action on the metrics that we say we have. Okay, this is where the true work comes in for us. And we shouldn't have to keep working this hard to do what we're trying to do, right? Those of us on this panel, we should be able to retire in a couple of years, right? But we can't, because there's so much work that still needs to be done. And the metrics have to be applicable and taken into action and taken seriously so that we can demonstrate sustainable culture change. Just my thoughts. Sorry.
There's so much to unpack there that resonant. And so, for example, Dr. Crutchfield talks about data. I look a lot at employee engagement data, but not in the aggregate. I disaggregate the data to see how different age groups are experiencing the organization, different racial groups, different sexual orientation, gender groups, things of that nature. To the best of our ability, how can we disaggregate data? And just recently, we've started to identify sexual orientation, gender identity in our employee data, so we can start looking at it from our members' perspective. But as Dr. Crutchfield says, it's not just collecting the data. That's the means. It's the analysis that's the ends, is where we have to go. Similarly with customers, we might look at customer satisfaction data in the aggregate to begin with, but then we have to disaggregate by geography, by age, by race, by ethnicity, by income, by whatever variables we have, just to see the patterns that emerge. And then from that analysis, as Dr. Crutchfield alludes to, we have to have a plan. Now, the interesting thing about a plan is we all want to fix the world, as do I. But if we don't, in our search to fix the world, we probably should start by making the bed. We should probably start by raking the backyard. So when we do a strategic plan, we should probably build in a short, medium, and long-term goals to sustain the party, to sustain the effort. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Crutchfield. If we do our work correctly, then we should be able to leave. Those seeds should be planted adequately. A structure should be in place. And here's the other key that was implicit in Dr. Crutchfield's, and if you don't mind, Doctor, I will call it a rant. And I thought it was absolutely But the idea of sustainability is so critical, that this isn't just a one and done. And with respect to the journey that she alludes to, there is no destination. There is no endpoint. Cultures are dynamic, circumstances are dynamic, and cultures flex and change over time. So if you learn women's issues in the 90s, you may not be the coolest on that. If you learn people of color issues in the 90s, those things have morphed. And lastly, what I would say is the move toward cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, cultural humility is a move toward behavior. The earlier models of cultural awareness, sensitivity are cognitive. I kind of given up on what people think. I'm more focused on our behavior. The idea used to be, if you think correctly, you'll do correctly. That hasn't really panned out. We move right to behavior. These are our expectations. If your brain follows along, great, but we're going to evaluate on these performance metrics. But it was really inspired by your words, Dr. Crutchfield. Didn't mean to call it a rant, as to minimize it.
I don't take it negatively at all.
Okay.
I have moments of passion.
And it looks like we've had a couple of questions come in from the audience. One of the questions is, I've noticed over the last couple of years some resistance to the verbiage cultural competence. So some want it replaced with cultural responsiveness, sensitivity, etc. In your opinion, where does this pushback come from?
I think a lot of us haven't really done a deep dive on what the models suggest. I think where the models align are typically around behavior, our attitudes, our practices, our policies, our governing structures. Are they ready for the 21st century, as Kesha alluded to earlier? I work in the cultural competence framework that I've over years. I've seen Bob Like and Melanie Turvalon do cultural humility. I've seen Ann Curry do cultural responsiveness. They're similar, not a whole lot of space between them. It depends how you define your model, quite frankly.
Yeah, I would agree.
Go ahead, Dr.
No, I would agree. I think that there's overlap in all of those concepts. And I think that the core, as you said, is around behavior, and it's about behavioral change. And if we're trying to be culturally competent, that means we're trying to ensure there is understanding, that there is clarity, and oh, by the way, that there is sensitivity and that there is responsiveness. So I think cultural competence encompasses all of those terms. And I think when we get caught up in words and we get caught up in divisiveness over those terms, we'll never move forward, because it's all under the same umbrella of creating a culture of understanding based on the need for behavioral shifts to be thoughtful and inclusive of all people. If I were to just make that a definition, that's how I would define all of this.
Yeah, I think also there's an idea that someone said to me recently, like, well, we'll never be fully competent in this. And so that was where some of the pushback came from, was the word competence. But I completely agree with what Dr. Crutchfield said around having all of those things being encompassed in cultural competence. It's not, we know, I think all of us, I can speak for all of us when I say that when we do this work, we share that this is a journey. This is not a destination. It's not a marathon. We're not going to get to a finish line. This is a consistent journey. And I also share with folks, I couldn't care less what you call it, right? Like cultural sensitivity, sensitivity, I couldn't care less what you call it, as long as you're doing the work, as long as you're demonstrating those behaviors. Because I get the same thing with DEI, and there's so many, and many of you might also be in organizations where you have a JEDI, you have DEIB, you have IDEA, you have all of these, and folks are so caught up in like, let's make it catchy, let's make it so that people are in tune with it, and they feel something, it evokes something when they hear it. I couldn't care less what you call it, as long as you are doing the work.
I think that's more profound than one might think, and I think you're absolutely right. And as Dr. Crutchfield said, there's so much overlap in terms of the models, and my definition of cultural competence implies humility, implies responsiveness. And then being a longtime academic, what do I think? I think academics like to name things. So our model was cultural competence. Before that, Jim Lee at University of Washington used ethnic competence. I saw Bob Like, University of New Jersey, Robert Wood Johnson School in New Jersey, did humility, as did Melanie Tervalon at California Endowment. And then I saw cultural responsiveness. And as I read the models, I'm like, seems pretty similar to me.
Saying the same thing.
Yeah. And so soup du jour, and as both of my colleagues say, do the work. Name it what you please.
Mm-hmm.
The other question that we want to address that came in from the audience, and Dr. Crutchfield, this might have been in your previous response. The question is, what has been a positive outcome from hearing from your employees that has led to an actionable outcome from the data or metrics that were pulled?
Oh, I could give many, but I'll give one that's a more current one and really a simple one. There were many expressions of concern related to adding Juneteenth as a holiday and being acknowledged in some way. And, you know, being in an organization that has now made that now it's not considered one of the actual full holidays, but the organization has 3 optional holidays. There used to be 2 optional. Now the third one is the option for Juneteenth. So you can use a floating holiday for one of these 3 options, which I think is progress, right? I take every move as progress. So I don't see that in a negative way, and helping individuals who push really hard for things like that to understand that's progress if it's now an added option. For me, it's now taking it to the next level. How do we make sure that when we market or put information out for holiday acknowledgements, we don't say things like, to all of our Black employees, happy Juneteenth? No, it has to be something that becomes a part of our culture, right? As a whole, cultural competence, where we have clarity and understanding of why Juneteenth is viewed as a holiday, why Juneteenth should be more closely linked to Independence Day, the 4th of July. How do we then pull that even back and go back to even January and build in something related to the Emancipation Proclamation? How do we pull those 3 forms or variation of independence for our country together under one umbrella so we can have a more celebratory approach that's reflective of all of these things? And that's just, Juneteenth is just one. We can look at some of the other, you know, demographics in our country where celebratory options around independence might need to be considered. So I would say that is an example where organizations look at data or input from the employees who voice their concerns and finding creative ways of meeting them where they are.
We had another question come in from the audience. What is advice on how DE&I officers can keep post George Floyd momentum at a time when leaders are rolling back commitment, especially at a time when DE&I is being pulled into the war that is being woke?
Yeah, I'll jump in and like to hear my colleagues respond, but going back to the rationale for it, market share, accreditation, licensure, reduced liability, all those things play a role. And so and you saw this kind of bump after George Floyd, and you saw this spike, and then you saw this kind of plateau, and we see this kind of decline. And we see a lot of states rolling back their DEI efforts. And so I think when we make DEI about those people, I think it's vulnerable. I think DEI has to be construed in the professional and the organization's best interest. If you want to work in the 21st century, you do this. You want to be a viable organization in the 21st century, you do this. And it has to be a sustained effort. For example, I was on a call this morning talking about NCQA, health equity accreditation. The certifiers are expecting this. Our funders are expecting this. Our payers are expecting this. And woe be unto us if our consumers expect this of us. So again, it isn't a one and done. I think Kesha talked about this, as there's not a destination, but the journey is well worth it. And I think that argument has to be made very strongly, and it has to be embraced by leadership. And as Dr. Crutchfield supported as well, it has to be supported by our board. And if our boards aren't on board, we might be vulnerable making these moves.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that, this whole concept of being woke, this whole concept of do it for the culture. Someone said to me, I was in a conversation with someone and I was talking about cultural competence and the type of work that I do. And the person was pushing back hard and saying, I'm just so sick of hearing people talk about this, do it for the culture. I said, well, I didn't say that. I talked about being culturally competent. Doing it for the culture or being woke, those are some current state terms that people are throwing around, and we're playing on words, right? What we have to really be thoughtful about is in thinking of commitment to this effort and work, it cannot be event driven. The death of George Floyd was a horrible scenario that should have never taken place. And it played out on the world stage. And it brought attention to this work that some of us have been doing for years to try and change the culture in our organizations. And if we understand this to be more than an event-driven effort, then the sustainability kicks in, right? And that work to say, you know what, I understand this happened, but we've been doing this and we got to keep going. We got to figure out how to do it and do exactly what Dr. Mason is saying. It has to be more than event-driven.
Absolutely. I completely, you took the words right out of my mouth. It has to be more than event driven. It has to be part of the work that you're doing overall in your organization and finding the why. Why are you doing this?
Why?
Because if
Yes.
it is in response to an event, then of course it's going to taper off, because then the feelings, the conversations, the notoriety around that particular event are going to taper off as well. So if it's event driven, then it's going to be all of the things that are being done in response to those events are going to fall by the wayside when folks stop paying attention to those things or stop talking about those things. But if it's built into who you are as an organization and the why, finding the why, communicating the why, and keeping that as the beacon, then it's not going to fall off. You do some things that are built into there to support folks when events happen, but it's not, the work that is being done is not driven by the events.
Correct.
Moving on to our next question, and I'll be interested in hearing responses from the panel. Can each of you share a success story where DEI leaders addressed resource limitations or competing priorities, enabling business leaders to prioritize and allocate resources for DEI initiatives? Kesha, let's have you kick this one off.
Yeah, so a few things is finding where the priorities overlap with in different areas of the organization. So I'm just going to talk about really quickly in my organization. One of the things that we did was, as we looked at where some priorities overlapped or there was some support needed from different folks or different departments to carry out some of the things, and we built like a Venn diagram. And so we came up with, we are fortunate. I know a lot of organizations also don't have a dedicated chief diversity officer or someone that leads that work. It's usually tacked on to someone else's work. And we're fortunate to have my role exist in my organization. And so we looked at the role that I carry and the responsibilities, the role of the chief HR officer and the role of our chief compliance officer, which is another role that many organizations also don't have, is a chief compliance officer, but we're fortunate enough to have all of those roles. So we looked at that like a Venn diagram, and through that, we actually came together, and I actually joke with folks and say we came together like Voltron, and we developed talent and culture. And so together we're the talent and culture arm of our organization. We all have our strategic plans for the departments that we lead. We all have our dedicated work that we're responsible for. And within that Venn diagram, the sections that intersect is the talent and culture team work that we do. So we facilitate our engagement surveys for our organization. And from that, we going back to one of the things that Dr. Crutchfield said, and being able to go back and get that data, right? Using that data, how are you using that? We do listening sessions. So we have an engagement survey, but we also do listening sessions twice a year with every single team in our organization. And so we travel across all of our areas and we meet with every single team, and we have those listening sessions. So we get real-time information as well, and not a point in time kind of information gathering from the engagement survey. We also do pulse surveys, and then we have opportunities, as I talked about, those opportunities for processing when events do happen. So I'll hold open office hours in person and virtually. so that folks can drop in and process some of those things, share some feelings, and be able to go through. We do breathing techniques and all kinds of things in those opportunities, and then celebrating employees and having fun as well. We just had a party in the park yesterday for our Rochester-based employees. So celebrating folks and having fun as well. And then looking at all of the areas, the entire life cycle of the employee. So those are some things I talk about when employees are there, but we have to look at recruiting, retention as well. And so being able to share those resources and looking at what are the things that HR is responsible for, where can my team under diversity, equity, and inclusion assist with those those goals that HR has in recruiting and retention. We developed education equivalencies, myself and our chief HR officer, to remove some of those barriers that we know that folks have had around education. It made no sense to me. It continues to make no sense to me why folks are advertising positions for an admin assistant and saying a bachelor's degree or a master's degree is required, right? And so outside of any type of credentialing that is, regulated or licensure, let's remove some of those barriers and be able to give folks the credit for their life experiences, their work experiences, and any part of education that they may have, developing standardized interview practices, and starting to post in different places. And so, because if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. So being able to look at all of those things, using our networks, and that's how we are able to look at some of those competing priorities where it's sometimes we may not have the budget to post in the places that we might want to post in, but we might have networks, folks in our networks that are able to share with their networks. So we don't necessarily have to pay the money to post it there, but we can get to those folks by sharing with our networks. In my introduction, Douglas mentioned that I'm a member of a sorority. And one of the things that I share with folks is for white folks, fraternities and sororities are a college thing. And once you leave college, you're like, I was a part of a sorority. For Black and brown folks, sorority and fraternity membership is for life. We have graduate chapters that are extremely active. So when someone shares, people in my network share their job postings with me, I share them with all of the fraternities and sororities in our area. That gives them close to, just in the Rochester area, that gives them close to 1,200 folks in all of those sororities and fraternities. That's just in Rochester. And that can then see that job posting for free. So being able to look at how you're using your networks in ways that are able to do some things in ways that you don't have to tap into your budget, but you're using the folks that you know in the places that they're in. And then lastly, with retention, we rewrote policies to make them more equitable, change the way our investigations with our talent and culture team. Our chief compliance officer used to be the only one that would see the investigations or employee complaints when they came in. And then she would have to make a determination as to whether it was something that HR needed to be pulled into or DEI needed to be pulled into. And now through our the system that we have, we even utilize IT because we needed a new system for how folks are putting those in. And so being able to have IT understand our needs and find a system that met our needs, pulled HR or IT into that DEI conversation and help them meet some of their needs around DEI as well. So all of those things, being able to look at that Venn diagram. And so now I get to see the complaints and the formal investigation requests as they come in real time. And I'm able to chime in and say, there's something that you all may not have seen with what's written there, but I see there's some history to the way that the person described this. There's some history there that DEI needs to be a part of this investigation, or there's nothing there. This is completely a performance review kind of thing or performance methodology that needs to be inserted there. So being able to look at all of those. And I know I said lastly, but second lastly and final lastly is the exit interviews. Looking at exit interviews and how you're doing those exit interviews from, because that data, as Dr. Crutchfield talked about, being able to get that data and do something with that information. So we changed ours from only having a survey to having a live exit interview with a member of the HR team and a survey option for anything that someone feels that they're not comfortable sharing in live with that person, and being able to request a conversation with the CDO, myself, the Chief Diversity Officer, the Chief Compliance Officer, or the Chief HR Officer as well in that survey, so that we're able to get information from them and do something with that. So that ran the entire gamut, the entire life cycle of an employee, in being able to address some competing priorities, looking at, and I'll go back to, again, that Venn diagram, where do those priorities overlap?
And I think, to just add to that real quickly, I think it's so important that what you just walked us through is a reflection of the importance of the collaboration that has to be in place. You've got to make sure that all parties are engaged in this type work. It can't just be, we have a D&I person, we have a vice president for diversity, we have a chief diversity officer. This is not work that's just for one person to do. It is an expectation that should be set from the top of the house all the way down. And that means there has to be solid communication. There should be a voice from the senior most leader, a voice on this diversity and inclusion topic. And there also has to be a regular setting of cadence of conversations between leadership and the employees and those who are stakeholders, key stakeholders in this effort around diversity and inclusion, and pulling all of those voices together and working more closely and succinctly, as Kesha just described, is vital for successful hardwiring of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and every other term you want to add in this work that we do of creating a more culturally competent environment, and specifically organization where everyone is treated in a fair and equitable way.
You are so right. It's everybody's responsibility, and every employee needs to understand how they contribute to it and be able to see themselves in it as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm trying to control my inner Gilligan, but I want to say ooh, 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 ooh to everything you guys are saying. For me, when I started doing this work, I think the average stint of a diversity officer was around 3 years. I think the most recent thing I've seen is they last about 2 years before they're out of there. They have to be aligned with their chief. If they're not aligned with their chief, they're supremely vulnerable. Here's the thing that happened for me was I was able to get my chief to do some of my community engagement events, some of my training events, and things of that nature. If it's not important to the bosses, it's not going to be important to the staff. I think it was both Dr. Crutchfield and Kesha alluded to the idea of role modeling. If it's not important to our bosses, it's not going to be important to us. It has to cascade from the top. If it doesn't happen there, it's not going to happen in the organization.
Yeah, I want to add one last thing. You are so spot on with that. And as Douglas introduced me, you mentioned Riverside Community Care. I'm the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion. I want to give a ever so quick shout out to Mr. Scott Bach, who was the founder and president of Riverside Community Care, which is a behavioral health organization located in Massachusetts. And Scott unexpectedly became ill and passed away within a matter of months in 2001. When I started with Riverside in 2020, he was literally the catalyst for a lot of the things that needed to be done differently. And he was so open to it. As the founder of this organization, the president of the organization, I had his ear. He was on board when I said, I need to meet with you directly every month. Can we set a cadence? We had a regular cadence of meetings. If I brought something to his attention that was concerning, he addressed it. If we wanted an announcement to go out from him, he happily wrote it himself with input from those of us a part of the committee or whatever the case may be. So you got to have that level of commitment and engagement from that chief, that lead, that primary person for this work to be successful.
Well said. And we're going to wrap up here. So I'd like to give a very special thank you to our panelists for sharing your insights and experience throughout our discussion. Feel free to scan their QR code to connect with them on LinkedIn. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for our past events, including the Halo series and mini series, where we feature thought leaders in a one-on-one setting and discuss what is keeping them up at night. Thank you everyone for joining, and please keep an eye out for the survey request early next week. We will have a version uploaded to YouTube on Monday. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, scan the QR code on the right for our next event that is scheduled for Friday, August 25th, where we'll discuss cultivating inclusive leadership and developing leaders who champion diversity and inclusion. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great weekend.